Thank you. And good afternoon. It's a real honor to be here with everyone and to participate in this very important conference. I'd like to begin by recognizing the importance and the significance of Sintercafe. Over the last 30 years, Sintercafe has played a crucial role by bringing us all together, by helping us make connections, both producers and consumers. These connections are absolutely critical, particularly because the coffee supply chain is so long and so complicated. Coffee grows in regions that make up 36% of the world's land mass. And perhaps it's ironic that the largest countries that are consuming countries, like my own, for example, don't grow any significant amounts of coffee. In the US, we grow coffee commercially in only two places, the state of Hawaii and the territory of Puerto Rico. There's also been some recent experimentation with growing coffee in the state of California and in the state of Georgia, but these are more of technical interests right now than anything else. And so as the largest consumer of coffee, we must import virtually all of our coffee, placing the US at one end of a very long and very complicated supply chain. We typically import our coffee as what we call a raw agricultural commodity. And this makes tracing the origins of our imports sometimes very difficult. Even though it can be very difficult to trace that supply chain, at the very moment that it becomes perhaps more difficult, this is rising or increasing as a matter of importance and significance for us. That is, traceability of the supply chain. First, both US consumers and businesses have an increased interest in sustainability, including practices at origin. Second, there are new and emerging food safety laws. And these laws really require us to look more deeply into the supply chain. And if that situation wasn't complicated enough, now there's a new law concerning labor practices at origin, which will also impact traceability and the need to look into the supply chain. So today I'm speaking to you not as a US government official, I'm speaking to you as president of our association. We're here as a partner for industry, but I'm here to speak about new US regulations and the impact that those regulations are going to have on all of us. Now, the subject of labor practices at origin is a very complicated one. Of course, you cannot separate any one piece of the supply chain from any other piece of the supply chain. Similarly, you can't break up the aspects of labor, culture, the market, the conditions under which your people operate. These are all integrated and deeply connected. The topic of labor in particular, this is not a new one for US companies, US coffee companies in particular. US importers and roasters, they typically have worked on traceability in their supply chain for many years. And the industry holds a number of positions against forced labor and child labor. We've also worked with the International Labor Organization, the ILO, and the US Department of Labor on child labor issues as well. So even though this is not a new question for industry and for government, and there now is something that is very important, that is different than what has traditionally been the circumstance. What has changed in particular is that President Obama signed a new law in February of this year. This gives US government officials the ability to withhold the release from customs of any product that they believe was produced with forced or involuntary labor. And this includes coffee. And so for the first time, if there are allegations that the coffee you're exporting or importing was produced with involuntary or forced labor, it's potentially subject to a withhold release order and potentially a seizure in the US. So this raises really important and fundamental questions. How can the US government do this? How can they just decide to do this? A second, what is different in the overall circumstances? What does this mean for all of us? And what should we do in light of these new circumstances? So let's take a little bit of a look at the context or the history, just to understand exactly what happened. Of course, we know that all of our markets are interconnected, but as I mentioned, labor's not a new issue. In 1919, the United Nations established the International Labor Organization, or the ILO. There are currently 187 members of the ILO. Members include Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, and the United States. The purpose of the ILO is to guarantee good labor conditions for men and women who are working. In the United States, a law was passed in 1930 to address this topic. This was known as the Tariff Act of 1930, and it prohibits the importation of anything, manufactured good or an agricultural good, if it is produced with forced or involuntary labor. But as with many different things, coffee was special when it came to this law. To protect the supply of coffee, an exemption was passed to this Tariff Act. Basically, the way the exemption worked was it said, we're going to forbid imports of anything produced with forced or involuntary labor. But if there's an insufficient domestic production to meet demand, then we'll let those goods into the U.S. So effectively, this kind of law has been on the books forever, but there's been an exemption or exceptions allowed for cases where there wasn't domestic production. For 85 years, the state of affairs allowed the coffee sector to effectively be self-policing. It allowed companies and growers and governments to do what they thought was necessary. But 9 months ago, this new U.S. law was signed, and it closes the exemption. So the exemption is no longer there. And as a result of this piece of legislation, with the very awkward name of the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, now allows for the potential for the government to step in. Specifically, the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol Agency, or CBP, now has legal authority at the ports of entry, where there are allegations to step in and prevent the release to an importer of coffee that has reasonably been suspected to be produced with involuntary labor. Now, there are a number of difficult aspects of how this law is being implemented. Nonetheless, this is not stopping the government from moving ahead. There have already been withhold release orders, but not of coffee. In particular, a number of industrial goods, soda ash, calcium, potassium hydroxide, certain types of fibers, and also a sweetener, stevia, all of which were produced in China, have been withheld from release as a result of this process. These withhold release orders were the result of complaints that were filed by non-governmental organizations that do work in China. In particular, they're focused on the Chinese prison system and the production of goods that are coming out of the prison system. So there's good documentation, there's an active NGO, and there's really no question about what's happening. These are prisoners who are producing these materials. Now, of course, in our own sector, we have many non-governmental organizations, many of which we work with and we support. In fact, we've also seen some other circumstances over the past 9 months. We've seen 2 reports from a European organization targeting labor practices in Guatemala and Brazil. So the fact is, although we have not been targeted, we eat coffee as a sector under this piece of legislation, there's certainly the potential for that to happen. Another thing that makes this very difficult, and I did this slide a couple of days ago before the results of the election were clear. You know, I was going to guess and just put Hillary up there, and I'm very glad I didn't. So there are a lot of open questions about, of course, that election and where we go from here. One of the difficulties is that the implementing regulations for this law have not yet been published. So what does that mean? It means that there's a law, the law has been passed, but exactly how it's supposed to work, nobody knows. So what's going to happen in terms of our transition in government over the next several months is that government officials and new government officials will be appointed. There'll be changes in policies. And it's really anybody's guess what's going to happen. It really leaves us all up in the air. Nonetheless, as we saw in the case of goods out of China, this does not prevent the government from acting under this law. So we're in a bit of a very unusual situation. We have no clear regulations, we have no clear process, we have a government in transition, but nonetheless, we have a government taking action in a bit of a vacuum. In the meantime, there are other things that happen that make this even more complicated. For many years, the U.S. Department of Labor has published an information list. This identifies countries and goods that may potentially have been produced with forced labor. I want to say potentially, I want to stress that. The purpose of this list has simply been to raise awareness with the industry, with the public. The Department of Labor is likely to continue to produce that list, and that's a separate thing completely. That's not the basis for any kind of action. So what do we all do in the middle of this incredibly confusing and potentially very, very difficult situation? We can suggest a couple of different things that we can do, that companies can do, that associations do, that we can all do working together to try to prepare ourselves for whatever's going to happen. A couple of things. A company, an import company, needs to be able to demonstrate that it's made every reasonable effort, and that's the language that's in the law, every reasonable effort, to determine the source of what it's importing and the type of labor that was used at each stage of the production process. So what does that mean, reasonable efforts? Well, here's some potential things that we could be doing. Having a company policy that is binding on the people that work for you. Making efforts to peer in a supply chain, going out and doing inspections. Bringing in auditors to periodically look at your supply chain and the various producers in your supply chain. Asking your suppliers to make attestations that they themselves know about the labor conditions under which the materials you're supplying were produced. Keeping good records, this is crucial. They love paper in Washington. Paper makes Washington move. Having records, having documents, being able to talk very specifically about what you've been doing is one way to address the issues created by this piece of legislation. Now, there's still the potential for coffee to be held by customs, and that's going to require some additional activity. Well, what else can you do if your coffee shipment is actually withheld from release by customs? Well, there are some options. For example, you might be able to supply a certificate of origin, again, attesting that no forced labor was involved in the production of your coffee. Also, a statement from the final consignee of the shipment that investigations have been undertaken, that good efforts have been made, that documents have been reviewed. Even if it's impossible to know for certain what happened, being able to demonstrate a good faith effort is crucial to working with customs and the government. It's likely, I would imagine, that some of you are hearing about some of this from some of your customers already. So I mentioned earlier that associations can play a role. We can all do something. We've been working to educate our members. We're trying to provide interpretations, we're getting legal opinions, we're providing documentation, and we're trying to help our members understand what exactly this means and what they should be doing. We've also been reaching out to the U.S. government. It sounds a little incredible or hard to believe, but this piece of legislation is supposed to cover everything. Sneakers, t-shirts, automobiles, shrimp, everything. So one of the things we've been doing is working in Washington to educate government officials about the reality of coffee, how different the sector is, how it works, how for a commercial roaster, taking delivery of a big container of coffee may simply not be possible to trace everything back to origin. The impression we've gotten so far is that the officials have been reasonable, they've been eager to learn, and they're happy to see that we're talking about this and we're aware of it. We think that's going to be helpful should there be an issue up the road, something that we have to address. So where do we go from here? What lies ahead? I think we've all come to recognize the importance of sustainability. We talk about it very often and first in environmental or ecological terms. We talk about it in other terms also. And the fact is there's no sustainability for coffee if the men and women who are producing coffee aren't treated properly and don't feel it offers them a good living. So this piece of legislation potentially is one more thing that'll help the sector become more sustainable. The other thing we need to do is to act in good faith. It goes back to something that I mentioned earlier. I think we probably would argue that it's impossible for us to know everything about every coffee production, about every facility everywhere. But we can make a commitment that when we become aware of an issue, when we hear that there's a problem, we'll look into it. We'll do our best to address the situation. The impression we have, again, is that we're not being asked to be perfect. We're not being asked to be unrealistic. We're being asked to be good corporate citizens and to do what we can under the framework of this legislation. And we're here to play our role. We've been, as I mentioned, speaking to folks in Washington. We invited a couple of officials to Miami. We had a small conference in Miami 2 weeks ago. They spoke to our members about this. I think they were happy to have an audience and to be addressing us. And that's the kind of communication and commitment we want to make to try to address this. So that's an overview. That's about the legislation, that's potential impact. I suspect that Cintra Café will make this available to everybody with some of the suggestions that will be in there in terms of where we go from here. But we don't really know what the future holds, partly because of the election, certainly, partly because other sectors have been more of a focus for this legislation, and not coffee particularly. But we need to be prepared, because the last thing any of us want is to be caught up with our supply chain broken unexpectedly and be unprepared to deal with that. Thank you for your time today. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thanks to our translators for taking care of everything.